The danger is that if we allow Iraq to develop chemical, biological, nuclear weapons, they will threaten their own region. There is no way that we would be able to exclude ourselves from any regional conflict that was there, as indeed we had to become involved last time they committed acts of external aggression against Kuwait. I've never said that Iraq's about to launch an attack on Britain, but if you look at the history of Saddam Hussein, there is absolutely no doubt at all that he poses a threat to his region. If he was to use chemical, biological or nuclear weapons in the rest of his region, there is no way that Britain could stand aside from that, or indeed the rest of the world. And that's precisely why we've had 12 years of United Nations resolutions against him. I didn't actually. I said they contained him up to a point. And the fact
is... I'm sorry, Prime Minister, we believe that the sanctions regime has effectively contained Saddam Hussein in the last 10 years. You said that in November 2000.
Well, I can assure you, I've said every time I'm asked about this, they have contained him up to a point. And the fact is the sanctions regime was beginning to crumble. It's why, subsequent, in fact, to that quote, we had a whole series of negotiations about tightening the sanctions regime. But the truth is the inspectors were put out of Iraq, so we've had no...
They were not put out of Iraq, Prime Minister. That is just not true. The weapons inspectors left Iraq after being told by the American government that bombs would be dropped on the country.
I'm sorry, that is simply not right. What happened is that the inspectors told us that they were unable to carry out their work. They couldn't do their work because they weren't being allowed access to the sites. They detailed that in the reports to the Security Council. On that basis, we said they should come out because they couldn't do their job properly.
That wasn't what you said. You said they were thrown out of Iraq.
Well, they were effectively, because they couldn't do the work they were supposed to do.
They were not thrown out of Iraq, though. They
sorry,
withdrew.
Jeremy. I'm sorry, Jeremy, I'm not allowing you away with that. That is completely wrong. Let me just explain to you what happened.
You've just said the decision was taken by the inspectors to leave the country. They were therefore not thrown out.
They were effectively thrown out for the reason that I will give you. Prior to them leaving Iraq, they had come back to the Security Council again and again and said, we're not being given access to sites. For example, things were being designated as presidential palaces. They weren't being allowed to go in there. As a result of that, they came back to the United Nations and said, we can't carry out the work as inspectors. Therefore, we said, you must leave because we will have to try and enforce this action a different way. So when you say the inspectors, when you imply the inspectors were in there doing their work, that is simply not the case.
I did not imply that. I merely stated the fact that they were not thrown out, they were withdrawn, and you concede they were withdrawn.
They were withdrawn because they couldn't do their job. Right. I mean, let's not be ridiculous about this.
Fine.
There's no point in the inspectors being in there unless they can do the job they're put in there to do. And the fact is, we know that Iraq throughout that time was concealing its weapons. Well, hang on, you say right. They were concealing their weapons. They lied about both the existence of their nuclear weapons program and their biological weapons program, and it was only when people were interviewed, when they defected from the Iraqi regime and were interviewed, that we discovered the existence, full existence of those programs at all.
Has not Colin Powell demonstrated yesterday, quite conclusively, that a regime in which those weapons inspectors are back in Iraq is one in which it is impossible for Saddam Hussein to continue developing weapons of mass destruction?
No, because what he is doing is engaging in a systematic campaign of concealment. And what Colin Powell was doing yesterday was giving evidence, for example, intelligence evidence and other evidence of direct conversations, which are evidence of the concealment that's happening. We still don't know, for example, what has happened to the thousands of litres of botulin and anthrax that were unaccounted for when the inspectors left in 1999. So, you know, the idea that
So you believe American intelligence?
Well, I do actually believe this intelligence.
Because there are a lot of dead people in an aspirin factory in Sudan who don't.
Well, come on. This intelligence is backed up by our own intelligence. And in any event, you know, we're not coming to this without any history. I mean, let's not be absurdly naive about
Hans
this.
Blix said he saw no evidence of hiding of weapons.
I'm sorry, what Hans Blix has said is that the Iraqis are not cooperating properly.
Hans Blix said he saw no evidence either of weapons manufacture or that they had been concealed.
No, I don't think, again, that is right. I think what he said was that the evidence that he had indicated that the Iraqis were not cooperating properly, and that, for example, he thought that the nerve agent VX may have been weaponized. And he also said that the discovery of the warheads might be, and I think I'm quoting here, may be the tip of an iceberg. I think you'll find that in that report.
You produced a dossier last September in which you outlined Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction. All the sites in that report were visited by UN inspectors who found no evidence of weapons or no evidence of their having been hidden.
I'm sorry. It is absolutely clear what has been happening over the past few months, which is, of course, I mean, the moment we mentioned those in our intelligence reports, we were aware of the fact that the Iraqis would then have a significant period of time in which they could conceal these weapons. But, you know, if this were some country that we had no history of this problem with, and this was the first time anyone had ever raised the issue, there might be a point in what you're saying. It is absurd in the case of... I don't concede it's true at all. It is absurd
Well, your own Foreign Office Minister Mike O'Brien said it was true.
It is absurd to say in a situation where Iraq has definitely had these weapons, developed them over a long period of time, concealed them, that there is nothing to be suspicious of when they can't even account for the weapons that we know were there when the inspectors left in 1999.
Right,
what there was evidence. I mean, look, this is what our intelligence services are telling us, and it's difficult because, you know, either they're simply making the whole thing up, or this is what they're telling me as the Prime Minister. And I've no doubt what the American intelligence are telling President Bush as well, and that is that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We know they were there before, that the Iraqis are now trying to conceal those, that although they're allowing the inspectors access to sites, they're not actually fully cooperating with the inspectors. For example, they're not allowing the experts that worked in these programs to be interviewed properly by the inspectors. And what Colin Powell was talking about at the UN yesterday was the systematic attempt to try and conceal this, to disperse it into the country so that it couldn't be found by the inspectors. So we're faced with a situation where, I mean, here am I as Prime Minister, this is the evidence that's coming to me, day in, day out, and I think it would just be wrong of us and irresponsible of me not to act on that. Now, if Iraq wanted to cooperate with the weapons inspectors, they could do it perfectly easily. They could say, here are all the experts that have worked in our programme, come and interview them, free from Iraqi minders, not in designated places. This is what's happened to the stuff that was left over from the inspectors before. If they did all that, they would be cooperating, and then I agree with you, it would be a different situation. Well, they're picking up, certainly, movements of material, and one of the things that Colin Powell was talking about yesterday was the movement of material shortly before an inspection took place. So, you know, you've got to put it all together and make a judgment.
Prime Minister, you must see the evidence that was presented yesterday as laughable. It was Morecambe Wise-esque, the Warhead sketch. It was just absolutely laughable what Colin Powell put in front of the UN yesterday.
Well, I don't think it was laughable at all.
Well, that's your point of view. The Prime Minister has said that he accepts the evidence. Monica Frisch.
Well, can I just deal with this for a moment? Look, leave aside what's been happening in the last few months and all the debate about whether we have a war in Iraq or not. I mean, you wouldn't dispute with me that this is a barbaric and appalling regime.
Well, I would say to you, Prime Minister, that the war is to get rid of a despotic dictator who has no real democratic mandate, who's very destabilising, who commits human rights violations. Is Mr. Bush next, perhaps?
Well, what, you think Saddam's the same as George Bush?
I'm saying Mr. Bush has a lot of comparisons.
Well, I think that's a bit unfair, you know.
Right.
I don't think George Bush is...
Criticising Iraq for developing nuclear weapons when we're doing so little to get rid of our own, isn't it incredibly hypocritical?
Prime Minister?
I don't believe so for two reasons. First of all, we're obviously part of a whole lot of agreements to do with nuclear weapons. Secondly, Britain has not menaced and used external aggression with these types of weapons against our neighbours. You know, Saddam, every time he has been allowed to do so, has started a war with the countries around him. He used chemical weapons against the Iranians some years ago. He invaded Kuwait shortly afterwards. I mean, he is, you know, in a sense, I can totally understand the argument about whether the war is right or wrong, and I understand the concerns that people have. I genuinely do, which is one of the reasons I wanted to do the programme tonight, to try and answer some of those concerns. But the one thing I hope we can all agree on is that Saddam Hussein is in a different category from virtually any other regime in the world in terms of his use of appalling repression against his own people, external aggression against other people, and the fact is he is the one power in this world that has actually used chemical weapons against his own people.
But
Prime Minister, I mean, if you're looking at countries in the Middle East that have got arsenals of chemical weapons, I mean, what about a country like Syria, which has the biggest chemical weapons arsenal in that part of the world, and whose president you invite to this country to have tea with the Queen?
But he has not started a war with his neighbours using those weapons.
Well, not using those weapons. He's had wars with Israel.
Well, no, I mean, look, there is a real issue to do with Syrian terrorism, which is important. But
It's a state sponsor of terrorism.
hang on, Syria has not started a war with its neighbours. Saddam twice, in fact, every time he's been allowed to, first of all, the war with Iran, in which 1 million people died. Secondly, the invasion of Kuwait. Now, Syria is not in that category. I'm not saying there aren't issues to do with Syria. There are issues to do with Syria, and we can get onto those. But the one point that I'm simply making to you is that this is not an issue that comes with no history, and a history particularly relevant to the nature of this regime. That's all I'm saying.
So they report back next week. Will you give an undertaking to this audience and indeed to the British people that before any military action you will seek another UN resolution specifically authorising the use of force?
We've said that that's what we want to do.
Well, you
so,
haven't given an explicit commitment that those are the only circumstances under which British forces will be used.
But what I've said is this. Those are the only circumstances in which we would agree to use force, except for one caveat that I've entered, and I'll explain exactly why I've done this. If the inspectors do report that they can't do their work properly because Iraq is not cooperating, there's no doubt under the terms of the existing United Nations resolution that's a breach of the resolution. In those circumstances, there should be a further resolution. If, however, a country were to issue a veto, because there has to be unanimity amongst the permanent members of the Security Council, if a country unreasonably in those circumstances put down a veto, then I would consider action outside of that. But that would be the only circumstance.
This is, you say, all about a man defying the wishes of the United Nations. You cannot have it both ways. If one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council uses its veto, and you, with your friend George Bush, decide somehow that this is unreasonable, you can't then consider yourself absolutely free to defy the express will of the Security Council. What's it for otherwise?
First of all, let me make 2 points in relation to that. Firstly, you can't just do it with America. You have to get a majority in the Security Council. Secondly, because the issue of a veto doesn't even arise unless you've got a majority in the Security Council. Secondly, the choice that you're then faced with is this. If the will of the UN is the thing that is most important, and I agree that it is, if there is a breach of Resolution 1441, which is the one that we've passed, if there is a breach and we do nothing, then we have flouted the will of the UN.
We have flouted the will of the UN.
Well, if we don't act in those circumstances. Look, the whole...
You're saying there's already an authorisation for war?
No, what I'm saying is this. In the resolution that we passed last November, we said that Iraq... I mean, it's actually interesting to look at the resolution. Iraq had what was called a final opportunity to comply. The duty of compliance was defined as full cooperation with the UN inspectors. The resolution then goes on to say any failure to cooperate fully is a breach of this resolution and serious consequences, i.e. action, would follow. Now, we then also put in that resolution that there would be a further discussion in the Security Council. But the clear understanding was that if the inspectors do say that Iraq is not complying and there is a breach of that resolution, then we have to act. Now, if someone comes along and says, OK, I accept there's a breach of Resolution 1441, but I'm issuing the veto, I think that would be unreasonable. Incidentally, I don't think that's what will happen. I think that we will, if the inspectors do end up in a situation where they're saying there is not compliance by Iraq, then I think a second